As Jesus walked along, he saw someone who had been blind from birth. The disciples asked Jesus, "Rabbi, was it this individual's sin that caused the blindness, or that of the parents?" "Neither," answered Jesus. "It was not because of anyone's sin, not this person's, nor the parents'. Rather, it was to let God's works shine forth in this person. We must do the deeds of the one who sent me while it is still day, for night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." With that, Jesus spat on the ground, made mud with his saliva, and smeared the blind one's eyes with the mud. Then Jesus said, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam." Siloam means sent. So the person went off and washed and came back, able to see. Neighbors and those who had been accustomed to seeing the blind beggar began to ask, "Is this not the one who used to sit and beg?" Some said yes, others said no. The one who had been healed simply looked like the beggar. But the individual in question said, "No, it was I." The people then asked, "Then how were your eyes opened?" The answer came, "The one they called Jesus made mud and smeared it on my eyes and told me to go to Siloam and wash. When I washed, I was able to see." "Where is Jesus?" they asked. The person replied, "I have no idea." They took the one who had been born blind to the Pharisees. It had been on a Sabbath that Jesus had made the mud paste and opened one's eyes. The Pharisees asked how the individual could see. They were told, "Jesus put mud on my eyes, I washed it off, and now I can see." This prompted some of the Pharisees to say, "This Jesus cannot be from God, because he does not keep the Sabbath." Others argued, "But how could a sinner perform signs like these?" They were sharply divided. Then they addressed the blind person again. "Since it was your eyes he opened, what do you have to say about this Jesus?" "He is a prophet," came the reply. The temple authorities refused to believe that this one had been blind and had begun to see, until they summoned the parents. "Is this your child?" they asked. "And if so, do you attest that your child was blind at birth? How do you account for the fact that now your child can see?" Intermission. Okay, let us continue. The parents answered, "We know this is our child, blind from birth. But how our child can see now, or who opened those blind eyes, we have no idea. But do not ask us. Our child is old enough to speak without us." Parents answered in this way because they were afraid of the temple authorities, who had already agreed among themselves that anyone who acknowledged Jesus as the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. That was why they said, "Our child is of age and should be asked directly." A second time they summoned the one who had been born blind and said, "Give God the glory instead. We know this Jesus is a sinner." "I do not know whether he is a sinner or not," the individual answered. "All I know is that I used to be blind and now I can see." They persisted. "Just what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" "I already told you, but you will not listen to me," came the answer. "Why do you want to hear it all over again? Do not tell me you want to become disciples of Jesus too." They retorted scornfully, "You are the one who is Jesus' disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but we have no idea where this Jesus comes from." The other retorted, "Well, this is news. You do not know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes? We know that God does not hear sinners, but that if people are devout and obey God's will, God listens to them. It is unheard of that anyone ever gave sight to a person blind from birth. If this one were not from God, he could never have done such a thing." "What?" they exclaimed. "You are steeped in sin from birth and you are giving us lectures?" With that, they threw the person out. When Jesus heard of the expulsion, he sought out the healed one and asked, "Do you believe in the chosen one?" The other answered, "Who is this one, that I may believe?" "You are looking at him," Jesus replied. "The chosen one is speaking to you now." The healed one said, "Yes, I believe," and worshiped Jesus. And Jesus said, "I came into this world to execute justice, to make the sightless see and the seeing blind." Some of the Pharisees who were nearby heard this and said, "You are not calling us blind, are you?" To which Jesus replied, "If you were blind, there would be no sin in that. But since you say, 'We see,' your sin remains." Holy wisdom, holy word. Thanks be to God.
Are you all familiar with the musical The Music Man? The original Broadway production had Robert Preston, and the movie had Robert Preston and Shirley Jones. Now I think it has Hugh Jackman. Anyway, The Music Man follows the story of this fictional little town called River City, Iowa, where a traveling con artist and salesman enters the town to sell band instruments and uniforms to parents of school-age children. Of course, the truth is that Professor Harold Hill is not a professor. He doesn't know the first thing about music, and he's able to sell band uniforms and instruments to these unsuspecting people by convincing them, in the words to one of the most famous songs in the musical, "You got trouble. I say trouble right here in River City." The trouble is in the form of a pool table, which is being delivered to the town for the first time. And Professor Harold Hill convinces people, first they're gonna have a pool table. Before they know it, their sons will be smoking and drinking and neglecting their chores. Their daughters will be wearing lipstick. The young folks will go down to the local club to listen to ragtime music, which will deliver the, quote, sounds of the jungle in an explicitly racist line. He tells them to watch for signs of corruption, like using slang words like swell and so's your old man. These well-meaning folks in this fictional town of River City, Iowa, are convinced to buy these uniforms and band instruments from a con artist because they see themselves as good people, upright people in a good Christian community. And the pool table represents outside influences, which the good people of River City want to keep out. This is the kind of goodness that prevents the full development of our humanity. And as I've said a number of times during this season of Lent, our journey towards the cross with Christ during this season is a journey toward deeper and fuller experience of humanness. St. Irenaeus famously said, "The glory of God is the human being fully alive." In this famous story of the person born blind, which comes from the 9th chapter of John's Gospel, which is the gospel we typically read during Lent, we have the same themes. What does it mean to be fully human? Who is included in the human family? These themes of inclusion and exclusion, which Jesus, in his typical way, seeks to undermine. Last week, we heard the story of another outsider, the Samaritan woman. In this story, Jesus sees the outsider who is someone who's been blind from birth. And the first question his disciples ask is, who sinned? Was it the person or was it their parents? Because of this disability, the person born blind is considered incomplete, imperfect by the society of Jesus' time. And being imperfect implies sin, because sin is nonconformity to the rules. That's back in the day and today. Good Christians today often feel we must project an image of goodness, happiness, to demonstrate our good relationship with God, our virtue. So sickness, depression, poverty, confusion, divorce, doubt, all of these ills might demonstrate a state of sin, a state of not being right with God. It's a classic reaction. Flaws, differences, states of being that do not conform to society's expectations around bodies. In our society, it's straight, white, able-bodied, cisgender people who set that bar. You know what cisgender means? It means someone whose gender identity corresponds to the sex they were assigned at birth. In other words, not transgender. I was bullied when I was younger for having frizzy hair, for being fat, for having a big nose. But the worst bullying came when I wanted to dress up as Robin Hood, which was not a girl's role. Nowhere is nonconformity punished more than in the category of gender. The insistence that there are only two genders and people must fit into these categories or there's something wrong with them. This is especially prevalent in authoritarian circles. We see it today in the centers of power in US government, in large churches. We see women with the long flowing hair and the fluttering eyelashes and the big lips, and we see men with the cleft in their chin. Did you know Pete Hegseth got plastic surgery to put that cleft in his chin? And muscles, right? So to get back to this question, was it the parent's sin or the person's sin that caused this state, this condition of being an outsider on the margins of society, unable to fully participate in the rituals of the temple, just like queer people today in many churches are not, they're like, oh, come in, but you can't be an authority. The person born blind is unable to work. They're reduced to begging for a living. Jesus answers, neither this person or the parents have sinned. No one has sinned. And the whole rest of the story serves to illustrate Jesus' full answer to the question of sin and judgment and how it relates to inclusion and exclusion. Jesus goes far beyond simply debunking the idea that if you don't conform, you or your parents must have sinned. He subverts and redefines the entire notion of sin. At the beginning of the story, we see that sin is viewed as a cause of this nonconformity. People who were blind, people who were missing limbs were considered unclean. They were unable to participate in the life of the temple, which was the center of society, because they might cause pollution. For the people of River City, Iowa, pollution comes in the form of a pool table. And people have to protect themselves. And they do this by encouraging wholesome pastimes like playing band instruments. For the Pharisees, and I want to be clear, we're not talking about the actual historical Pharisees. We're talking about a trope that is used as a foil for Jesus. Anybody can be a Pharisee. For the Pharisees, sin means ritual impurity and exclusion. If we follow the story through, though, this kind of long story, we see that the sin Jesus is talking about, the sin of the Pharisees, that's also the sin of the people of River City, is the real sin. The group proclaims itself as good and normal by excluding other people, other human beings. The fear of the other, of difference, becomes a willful blindness to our shared humanity. We see this everywhere. It's called blaming the victim. It's called scapegoating. Unifying a group by excluding and demonizing people who don't conform. Today we see this scapegoating used by modern day con artists in the same way Harold Hill used it in The Music Man. Specifically, many Christians, including some I went to seminary with, including the prominent theologian N.T. Wright, who I heard speak last week, scapegoat trans and non-binary people. They make up ridiculous lies, from calling them Gnostics who hate their bodies to talking about kitty litter in kindergarten classrooms. They make up bizarre and cruel laws about restrooms and sports. And most recently, in the state of Kansas, they have revoked the driver's licenses of trans folks. Think about that. In Iowa this week, home of the fictitious River City, civil rights protections on the basis of gender identity were revoked. It's hard to present statistics on violence against trans and non-binary folks because so much violence is still ignored or covered up. From 2018 to 2022, there were 48 separate anti-trans laws passed in 19 states, and this has led to an exponential increase in suicide attempts by trans and non-binary youths, a population that's already at much higher risk of suicide and suicidal ideation. The murder rate against trans people is significantly higher than the general population. Trans women of color specifically are killed at a dramatically higher rate. So what does this have to do with the formerly blind person? Jesus carries out an act of inclusion. He spits on the earth, he makes mud, and he anoints the blind one's eyes. And there's a Hebrew pun, clay is Adamah. It's how God originally made Adam, the first human. Transphobic Christians often cite Genesis, which says God created male and female, but Adam, the first human, is neither male nor female. Adam is not a proper name, but a word that means something like mud person or earthling. God creates earthlings in all sorts of shapes and colors and gender identities and sexual identities. Gender is not a fixed state, but something that can move and change and be drawn into deeper communion with the Holy One, who, guess what, has no fixed gender. The person born blind was born not flawed, but unfinished, as we all are. We are all in the process of becoming, being created every day by the Holy One. Remember that funny sign you'd see that said, "Be patient with me, God isn't finished with me yet." It acknowledges that being human is not a static state. God is always inviting us into deeper healing and wholeness, into co-creation with the great artist of the cosmos. As the psalmist says, you are God's work of art. So Jesus, in using the mud he makes from his saliva, is finishing or continuing adding on to the creation of this person born blind. None of us has been brought to the fullness of humanity yet. None of us is complete. In this instance, Jesus adds the clay to form a person with eyes, also indicating that Jesus is the Holy One. Then the blind person has to go and wash in the pool, which is a ritual of inclusion. We've adopted it as baptism, where a person is welcomed into the community. Now the formerly blind person gets a voice and gets to speak and says, "No, it was I." The Pharisees try to dismiss the person by talking to the parents, and the parents are like, no, our child is a full person and can speak to you directly. Then we see another attempt at exclusion. They say, we are the disciples of Moses, but you are not. But the healed one uses the language of inclusion. They say, we all know that God listens, inviting everyone together, even the ones who want to exclude. They even start to kind of joke a little bit with the Pharisees. You want to be his disciples too? Including. The former blind person has moved into deeper humanity. The clay, the Adama that Jesus used, moved the person from someone without a voice, without maturity, without membership in the tribe, to become an included adult. And also a pretty good interpreter of the ways of God. They speak the famous words, once I was blind, but now I see. Words that are now part of the most famous Christian hymn probably of all time. Shortly afterwards, they meet Jesus directly, which draws them even further toward completion and healing. The Pharisees try to get out of the problem by denial. They deny this person wasn't really blind. It wasn't really that person. This is like denying the existence of trans people who have existed since the beginning of humanity. As an aside, I recently learned that one of the most beloved characters in ancient Near Eastern literature, the wise woman Shamat from the Epic of Gilgamesh, was most likely a trans woman. It's she who tames Enkidu, the wild man, helping him to become more fully human. But if you want to know more about that, ask me later. Otherwise, this sermon will be like 2 hours long. At this point, the in-group, whether it's the Pharisees or the good Christians, become upset because they have to continue to insist that their group is good on the basis of the people they exclude. But at this point, both groups have unified themselves by excluding Jesus, who comes to us all in marginalized people. At the end of the story, we see that Jesus says, I have come into the world for judgment. He uses the word krima, which is where we get the word crime. He's rendering a verdict. The verdict is the sightless see and the seeing are blind. That's his verdict. That's his judgment. And of course, the Pharisees get upset and say, you're not calling us blind, are you? And Jesus says, if you were blind, there would be no sin in that. But since you say we see, your sin remains. In other words, the sin is not to be blind. We're all blind in some way. We're all works in progress. The sin is claiming completion, perfection. The sin is lack of humility. No ability to learn, to grow, to admit your views need to change. That's when they miss the mark of humanity, forgetting that the word human comes from humus, meaning earth, the clay shaped every day by the hand of the Creator. Jesus has changed the definition of sin from breaking a law, being divergent, to insisting on conformity and excluding others. In other words, the living Word of God is constantly subversive of our notions of order, of goodness, of morality, constantly subversive. Humans are unfinished creatures, and so we allow our loving Creator to continue to mold us and invite us into co-creation and co-subversion. And who better to teach us how to become more human than our transgender siblings, who understand what it means to journey towards a truth that is ever unfolding, to embody what the expansive divine who knows no fixed gender, who is beyond any one human image or concept, and yet closer to us than our very breath. Once we were blind, but now we begin to see the truth that has been there, these humans who have existed on the margins for so long. Trans people are a living, walking testimony to the artistry of the Holy One, whose creativity is mirrored brightly in gender diversity. God's creativity is mirrored in the uniqueness and beauty and holiness of each individual human being. May our eyes be open. May our hearts and minds be open to this truth as God reveals it more and more deeply this Lent and every day. Amen. Our hymn of reflection is Out of Darkness. It's in Gather 6.